Alright, greetings. What's good, everyone? This is Chris Dixon, and I am back with another episode and discussion here on the Tunnel Vision Podcast. Hope you all are doing good and well. On this particular discussion, I will be talking about the Apostle Paul and his influence on the early Christian Gnostics, so to speak. And I will be building a little bit here shortly from the book titled Jesus and the Lost Goddess, The Secret Teachings of the Original Christians by Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy, who are the authors of the Jesus Mysteries. And this is a good book to have on early Christianity and Gnosticism. They go very deep into the mystical origins of Christianity. So I highly recommend getting this book. All right. So I'm going to build from this particular book here shortly on the early Christian Gnostics, who were known as the Paulists, so to speak, who was a group of Gnostics who looked up to Paul to be their primary Gnostic messenger, so to speak. But Paul, he had a very huge impact on the early Gnostics. He himself was highly influenced by Gnostic thought, so to speak. Paul talked a lot about the concept of the Christ within and how Christ dwell within him, okay, as well as inside of each and every one of us. So the concept of the Christ within was highly acknowledged by the Gnostics to be one of their important prerequisites and understandings of this inner gnosis, okay, that they talk about. So what is the Christ within? The Christ within is acknowledging your soul, okay? Your soul, which is consciousness, okay, itself, is the Christ, all right? So your true self, okay, which is the Christ, all right, is who you truly are, okay? And coming into this particular self-awareness of consciousness, okay, being inside of your physical body, that is when you develop, okay, or what they would call knowledge of self, all right? And this particular knowledge of self is knowledge of your own true divinity, okay, as a Christ in a physical body, okay, within yourself. So when it came down to Yeshua, okay, when it comes down to Yeshua, the Gnostics did not look towards Yeshua, okay, as an individual to be worshipped, nor did they put him on a pedestal and made themselves inferior to him, okay? They understood Yeshua to be a symbolic representation or a metaphor to reach a certain level of spiritual awareness about themselves, okay, known as the Christ consciousness, okay? So this particular level of self-awareness, okay, that this particular figure known as Yeshua or Jesus, okay, he obtained this particular level about himself, okay, about his own true divinity as a Christ, okay? So the Gnostics, they understood that it was their responsibility to reach that same level of realization, okay? It was about becoming the Christ, okay? It was never, one man who was the true Christ, okay? It was a collective concept, okay, that every body within the collective, each and every one of us was to obtain within ourselves, okay, during our time on earth. Okay, that was the true mission, goal, and work of the early Gnostics. So Yeshua, who was seen as the primary Gnostic messenger, okay, the Gnostics also understood Paul to be another important Gnostic messenger. All right. Because like I said, Paul talked a lot about the Christ within, okay, and the Christ within being a very important concept within Gnostic thought, okay, acknowledging your true self, which is consciousness, okay, being the true Christ, okay, the one consciousness of God, so to speak. So we as the collective, okay, we are the Christ, all right? And all we have to do is come into that realization, all right? And that's the whole example of Yeshua in the eyes of the Gnostics, okay? And of course, that particular example was then changed into the concept of a personal savior and, and things of that nature by the later day church. But to the early Gnostics, it wasn't seen that way. All right. So when it came down to Paul, okay, the Gnostics understood Paul to teach a lot of Gnostic thought and framework, so to speak. And that's what I'm getting ready to get into right now. So this is from chapter 2, okay, of this particular book. So I'm going to be building on the Paulist, so to speak. Of all early Christians, Paul was the most revered by later Gnostics. He was the primary inspiration for two of the most influential schools of Gnostic or Christian Gnosticism set up by the early 2nd century masters, Marcion and Valentinus. Christian Gnostics, calling themselves Paulicians, ran the 7 churches in Greece and Asia Minor that were established by Paul, the mother church being at Corinth. The Paulicians survived until the 10th century and were the inspiration for the later Bogomils and Cathars. Marcion was originally a student of the Simonian Gnostic Credo, and the Simonians were a group of Gnostics whose teacher was Simon the Magus, okay, and y'all can read about him in the book of Acts, okay. But the Simonian Gnostic Credo, okay, but when he set up his own highly successful school, it was Paul he placed center stage as the great messenger. Even his later literalist critics acknowledged that Marcion was a veritable sage and that his influence was considerable. Valentinus tells us he received the secret teachings of Christianity from his master Theodotus, who had in turn received them from Paul. Based on these teachings, Valentinus founded his own influential school of Christian Gnosticism, which survived as a loose alliance of individual teachers until it was forcibly closed down in the 5th century by the literalist Roman Church. The number of 2nd and 3rd century Valentinians that we can still name is testimony to Valentinus' importance, and their names are Alexander, Ambrose, I can't pronounce this word, Axionicus, Candidus, Flora, Heraclian, Mark, Ptolemy, Secundus, Theodotus, and Theodamus. Okay, those are their names. Paul was such an important figure in the Christian community that at the end of the second century, the newly emerging school of Christian literalism could not simply reject him as a misguided heretic, but felt compelled to reshape him into a literalist. They forged in his name the now thoroughly discredited pastoral letters, in which Paul is made to spout anti-Gnostic propaganda. Throughout his genuine letters, however, Paul uses characteristically Gnostic language and gives Gnostic teachings, a fact that is deliberately obscured by literalist translators. So, out of Paul's 13 epistles, he actually did not write all of them. The ones that he wrote were Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, Philippians, and Philemon. Okay, those are the ones that Paul actually wrote. The ones that he did not write, that were forged in his name, were Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Titus. And specifically in the epistle of 1 Timothy, the concept of gnosis or Gnosticism was spoken against. Okay, but Paul was actually not the one that was speaking against Gnosticism. It was someone else or another writer who was simply using Paul's name to get his point across. Okay, so the Christians, they tried to turn Paul into a literalist, okay, to pretty much discredit him from being influenced by Gnosticism himself, okay. But as we read a little bit further, Paul actually uses Gnostic terminology, okay, in his other epistles. So like later Christian Gnostics, Paul addresses his teachings to two levels of Christian initiates called psychics and pneumatics, describing the latter as having gnosis. Of himself he writes, "I may not be much of a speaker, but I have gnosis." He sees his mission as awakening in initiates an awareness of the Christ within, which is the one consciousness of God, by instructing all without distinction in the ways of Sophia, whose name of course means wisdom, so as to make each one an initiated member of Christ's body. Paul tells us that when he personally experienced Christ, it was a vision of light on the road to Damascus. Damascus was a code word used by the Essenes to refer to their base in Qumran, which suggests that Paul, like Simon, had Essene affiliations. He uses the same language as the Essenes, for an example, when he describes human beings as being enslaved by the powers of fate, imagined as the elemental rulers of the cosmos, the archons of this dark cosmos from which Christ has set us free. Paul, like Simon, was an internationalist who wanted to liberate Christianity from any baggage it had inherited from Jewish literalism. He writes dismissively of the traditional Jewish law. "I count it as so much dung. All I care about is knowing Christ, experiencing the power of the resurrection, sharing his sufferings, and growing conformity with his death, so that I may finally arrive at the resurrection from the dead." Again, like Simon, Paul is adamant that the true God is the inevitable oneness, not the national Jewish deity. Do you suppose God is the God of the Jews alone? Is he not the God of the Gentiles also? Certainly of the Gentiles also, if it be true that God is the one. For Paul, Jewish literalism divides Jews from Gentiles. It is a curse, which could be healed by the syncretic figure of the Jewish Messiah/pagan God-man Jesus. He explains that Jesus has broken down the enmity that stood like a dividing wall between Gentiles and Jew, creating out of the two a single humanity in himself, thereby making peace. This was his purpose, to reconcile the two in the oneness of God. However, although Paul wants to dump Judaism, he doesn't completely condemn it as Simon did. He accepts that it is appropriate for those Jews who wish to maintain their indigenous traditions, but maintains that it is irrelevant to Gentiles and Jewish initiates who wish to leave the old ways behind. For Paul, Jesus fulfills the law and the prophets, precisely because he takes us beyond them. Of Paul's later followers, the Valentinians, maintained this more liberal approach. Marcion, however, amplified Paul's criticism of Judaism. He wrote a famous treatise called Contradictions, setting out all the differences between the God of the New Testament and the God of the Old Testament, as a way of distancing Jesus from the figure of the Jewish Messiah. Marcionites and others with a similar perspective claim to follow Jesus Christos, spelled Chrestos, which means Jesus the Good, rather than Jesus Christus, spelled Christus, which is Jesus the Messiah. From as early as the middle of the 1st century through to the 5th century, we hear of those calling themselves Christians rather than Christians. Very interesting. But as you can see, Paul had a huge impact on the early Christian communities, even to the point to where some of his letters were forged in his name to try to counter Gnostic thought, okay? But in his epistles that is attributed to him, he talks a lot about, he speaks on different Gnostic themes and concepts, such as the psychics and the pneumatics. When you go into Gnosticism, the Gnostics, they characterized individuals into 3 categories: the helix, the psychics, and the pneumatics. Okay, the pneumatics were considered to be the true Gnostics. These were the ones who truly had this inner gnosis, okay, who were fully aware that they themselves were the Christ, okay, in the physical body, okay. They understood that they were consciousness, okay, in a physical body. And they were truly on the path of gnosis, all right. The psychics would be the individuals who were borderline Gnostics, okay. These were pretty much individuals that were in the middle, okay. Individuals who were on the verge of obtaining this inner gnosis and awareness of themselves, but there was a part of them that was still heavily connected to the material realm, okay. They were still highly influenced by this material existence, okay, to the point to where it was keeping them from fully tapping into this inner gnosis, okay, keeping them from fully developing the pneumatic understanding of this inner gnosis, okay. So they were borderline, okay, or what they would call intermediaries, all right. So pretty much being in the middle. The helix, on the other hand, these were individuals who were fully immersed in the material realm or matter, so to speak. So these individuals were not at all interested in obtaining this inner gnosis. Okay. They were pretty much considered to be babes, so to speak. So individuals who were not at all concerned with obtaining deeper spiritual awareness about themselves or this particular gnosis, okay, about their true divinity. All right, these were individuals who were completely ignorant to gnosis. All right, so the Gnostics, they characterized or put individuals into these three categories. Okay, Helix, spelled Hylics. Okay, the psychics and the pneumatics. All right, so Paul specifically talked about the psychics and the pneumatics specifically. So these are two terminologies that stem out of Gnostic thought, all right, as it pertains to this particular gnosis, all right. So in his particular epistles that are attributed to him, he builds on the concept of psychics and pneumatics, all right. And like I said, his epistles, half of them are attributed to him, the other is not. Another good scholar that you can look into, two actually, Bart Ehrman and Elaine Pagels, okay? Both of them talk about the Gnostics a lot in their books, right? Bart Ehrman, he wrote a book called Forged, Writing in the Name of God, why the authors of the Bible are not who we think that they are, okay? And he teaches at the University of North Carolina, all right? And he wrote this particular book, which is very excellent to have when understanding early Christianity and how the Bible was written and how it came into existence. And he talked a lot about how forgery was highly practiced during the writings of the New Testament and how forgery actually made its way into the New Testament, as you can see here with the with some of the epistles of Paul. Okay, so he talked a lot about that in his book, and of course Elaine Pagels, who teaches at the University of Princeton. She has written several books on Gnosticism, okay, and she wrote a book called The Gnostic Paul, where she talked a lot about the Gnostic themes and framework within the epistles. So Bart Ehrman and Elaine Pagels are two excellent scholars to look into for more information on the Gnostics, okay? But Paul, was very influential amongst the early Gnostics. He himself, of course, was influenced by Gnostic thoughts, as I just stated, how he talked about the concept of the psychics and pneumatics and the overall concept of the Christ within, okay? These are concepts that stem from the Gnostic worldview, okay? So that's why you had a group of Gnostics who were known as the Paulicians or the Paulists, okay? Because they acknowledged, Paul to be a Gnostic teacher, okay? And another revealer of this inner gnosis, so to speak. But that's pretty much all that I have for this particular discussion. I don't want to keep everybody long on this discussion. So look more into Paul's influence on Gnosticism. Check out this particular book, Jesus and the Lost Goddess, The Secret Teachings of the Original Christians by Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy. Okay. Highly recommend getting this book. But if y'all enjoyed this particular discussion, like and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Okay. Continue to listen in to the podcast on Spotify and other major podcast platforms. Hope that you all enjoyed it. And I will talk to you all on the next discussion. Peace.